Hello and welcome to another instalment of the Wyfutbol podcast with me, Michael Dryden and Etches Adokru. Today, I'm very pleased to say we are joined by Julio Costa. Julio is a data scientist at Fulham and has held multiple recruitment and performance analyst roles, including some time at Mansfield Town as a recruitment scout. Julio is joining us today to talk about life as a data scientist in football. So, Julio, sorry, I called you Julio. The reason I've called you Julio instead of Julio by mistake there is because Sunderland used to have a player called Julio Arca that everyone used to call Julio. So that's just a bit of habit. But welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much. I'm doing well. Actually, you were not wrong because I'm Portuguese, so we do pronounce the J.
Ah, good.
Yeah, but I'm used to it. Like I know a lot of people that just call me Julio. I'm whatever. Like as long as you spell it right, I'm completely fine with that. To be honest.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, Julio Walker is Argentinian, so there must be that difference there. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Before we get into the episode, is it true? Is it true from your Twitter bio that you speak 5 languages? Is that true?
Yes, it is very true.
Wow. I've barely got a grasp of English, so I mean, you've knocked me out the water. Um, so Julio, just to kick things off, do you mind letting our listeners know about your background in football and yeah, have you always worked in the data side?
So yeah, so my background is quite really interesting. Considering I'm a data scientist. I I was a well. I played football in smaller clubs in Lisbon, uh,
Mhm.
and I was not very good. I was very average, right back. Couldn't even deliver across to the box. That was not too much. Yeah, and the only thing I had was pace, and this was like I don't know 20 years ago, where right backs you just run and track back, and that's it. You don't pass the halfway line, and I think with players like Cafu and stuff like that, things started to change a little bit.
Mm,
Overall. And it's interesting how now you see trends, and that's like the process of the evolution of football in terms of just one position.
mm.
And yeah, and I was a very average football player. Played some futsal as well. It was quite fun, and had a lot of injuries as well. And I thought I'm not going to make it. And then Mourinho came to stardom in Portugal, and every kid who played Football Manager or Championship Manager, it's like, okay, I want to be the next Mourinho. I want to watch I don't know how many hours of football from my pre and teenage years, just to learn as much as of football as I could, because it was something I really wanted. And after my high school, my grades were not that great, so obviously I had to take a sabbatical 1 year to just figure things in life, and came a really good opportunity for me to improve my English actually in Texas. So I moved to Texas when I was 19, and from there just improving, going and apply for actually my undergrad degree. I applied for computer science, but as my freshman here, it was really tough with some of the classes, so I just decided,
Mm.
oh, I really want to follow my dream of being a football coach. And I changed my major to sports and coaching. And after graduating and having some interesting experiences, just like as a volunteer coach in the men's club, which was not even a proper team, it was just a men's club. And okay, that was quite interesting, going around and see how the coach would prepare the sessions and things like that, would help out, just the basic things. And then I moved to London and started coaching for, let's say, it's 4 years, and 4 years of coaching, improving a lot, just smaller teams, things like that. Eventually, start coaching different levels, in small clubs and things like that. And I got to work for the Chelsea Foundation as well, which was quite interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, it was a bit of a step up in terms of how good the kids were, but then again, you could see maybe three players that could have a go at the academy, but it's just really crazy how a lot of kids, and I mean, we've been there as kids, you really dream to become a football player, but the level that you're required to do that at a high level is just insane.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
and from there just coaching, and then lockdown number one happened, and I'm currently finishing a master's at St. Mary's University in performance coaching, and I had a really interesting module in performance analysis just before the first lockdown that semester in January 2020, and I really enjoy it, really like it. I thought it was really interesting to mix it up with coaching, so I started working for two clubs. One was for Kent Football United, girls under 16 team. It was a quite interesting experience as well. It was the first time I was coaching in the women's game. Alongside, I was coaching and started kind of to implement a performance analysis setup at a private company. It was really challenging. Um, in terms of footage, it was everything was recorded in an iPad, so it was a nightmare to do that. So that's another thing. If you're working in performance analysis, you need at least a very decent camera and a high place to get the all the aerial footage, so you can actually do things that we call coding the matches, because that's, when you work for clubs that don't have any big departments and you're just the only person coding the matches, getting all the stats from that match, plus doing all the pretty, oh, where this pass starts, where this pass kind of pass maps, and where the players receive the ball and so on by yourself. It's just a crazy amount of time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, so you're actually like inputting the data as well, obviously, because at certain levels, even if it's at a football league club, um, they might not necessarily have they're under, I don't know, their academy teams, they're under 15s or under 14s, and there might not be a team of people there taking in the data. So do you have to take in the data as well at that level, as well as then take that afterwards, and then also put the recording together? It's it sounds like you have to become a cameraman overnight.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's funny because you start seeing some volunteer roles for, I don't know, non-league clubs asking for a cameraman. It's not even like full journalists. They really want a cameraman just to record and take some highlights and just show to the manager. It's really funny. I remember I applied for some role, and the guy literally replied to me saying, "Oh, we just need a cameraman. Really, we don't need." It's like, oh, it's like, I could actually do much more than that, but it was really interesting. And from there, just getting more experience, kind of like playing with different platforms. Uh, One thing that led to it, actually, I tried to mix it up with a platform called Tableau, which is amazing. Anyone that's listening and wants to get into data, it's really good. There's a free version. It's called Tableau Public, and I started creating uh, some end passes. Where did they start? Where did they finish? All these different events from the footage that I had. Or let's say this academy, we would play against Welding United, for example. They have video cameras, so we I could watch the game and just do it that manually. Still hard work as well, but with better footage. And just going, and then I found this amazing Twitter community where there's loads of people that are data scientists, or like they're just
Mm.
navigating through that path, and not even working for any professional football clubs. You see kids that are 16-year-olds that are doing amazing things, and I was like, when I was 16, I was definitely not doing that actually, you know. And you got like, I really want to learn, and I guess I always had this curiosity part of me that trying to learn how to do something new. I'll be like, okay, well, this is a new skill. I'm just gonna self teach myself how to do that. And to be fair, like we can say really bad things about the internet and the damage that it does to people, which does, but we often don't look at the great impact that the internet, because I found so many useful resources to try to learn different graphs or how to manipulate data a certain way, and that really helped me to become proficient on this platform, and I'm really grateful.
I imagine that's how a lot of, we talk about 16-year-old kids who've got these great skills. Like they, I don't follow the data community just generally in football as much as I follow the fantasy Premier League community, which I do follow quite a lot. And some of the people on there, even just on fantasy football related, are pulling these kind of graphics together, these and analyses. And that's not only just because, I mean, it's kind of a sign of how the internet is, as you said, of skilled people to allow them to use these kind of tools like Tableau and so, but also just the availability of data and information online just makes it so much easier now. If you went back 25 years, even in the Premier League, the availability of a lot of the data that we scrutinize now, even at a fantasy football level, um, wouldn't have been available or so readily available that the 16-year-old um, person can just take that. But yeah, it's yeah, it's good to hear. It's good to hear that you learn new skills because I certainly don't know how to use Tableau, and I wish I did. So, so yeah, so moving on. So now currently you are a data scientist at Fulham, Julio. And before I ask you about your brief stint at Mansfield Town, because I'm really interested in the lower leagues and how that works there, do you mind telling us about your role at Fulham? And also, I'll be really interested to know, and I think our listeners would as well, how you define the role of a data scientist at a football club, or even how your football club defines it.
Well, my role has been really interesting so far. It's the first time that I'm working full time for a professional football club. My previous roles in football, and they were professional ones or semi pros, were always volunteer or part time or just hourly rates. So it was not something very solid.
Mm.
Um, and what I would say of my role is pretty much I'm working more with the academy on everything from under nines to under 23s, providing all the data. Let's say coaches want to take insights of a certain player or the teams in general. They want to know, okay, which player is faring in this age group. Now, keep in mind that it's only preseason, but there's going to be a time that, according to uh, other Premier League status academies, that you need to do certain things and keep certain track of measurements of players, which we have loads of tracking variables. So there's someone who needs to actually made it nice and presentable for the relevant stakeholders. So it's really interesting because I get to work with coaches, with performance analysts, medical teams in terms of what sort of data they want. And unfortunately, because of COVID rules, now it's a bit more relaxed. But every club, and not don't speak this necessarily Fulham, but I assume that lots of clubs at some point, because of COVID restrictions, you had to have bubbles for each age group and so on. So it kind of made it difficult, that's in that sense for a lot of people that I know that work in football. But I'm really enthusiastic about the role, really exciting, enjoying learning new skills, kind of like getting to know what people like and what not. So it's very important as a data scientist that you know exactly how to relate and talk with other departments. That's like a very big thing in my opinion.
Yeah, I can imagine it being the case with any type of industry. Really, you got to be able to not only be good at your job on the technical side of things, but also to be able to communicate with other departments. Also, Julio, I'm a Tableau user, so ignore Michael. He's an amateur. He's an amateur, but I use Tableau in my day job, and unfortunately, not to analyze football data, but some other things as well. But the question I kind of had was one thing I hear a lot about when I speak to analysts like yourself or data scientists or a lot of backroom members of staff for scouting as well in football is a lot of them start volunteering, like you said, and a lot of them do quite small jobs to work their way up. A, a question I've always wanted to know is: do you think that a lot of these analytics departments across the board, not saying Fulham specifically, but from the top of the Premier League all the way to the bottom, would you say that they're understaffed? Do they need to have more members of staff to begin with? Because it seems as if a lot of the time work can be so competitive and so hard to come by when clubs could probably do with bigger teams to begin with.
No, I agree 100% what you're saying, and I'm sure that championship level, maybe very few clubs have and it comes back to financial, um, uh, struggles for certain clubs in terms of having big departments or small departments or having a performance analysis department. I know a club I'm not going to mention, but I know a club in League Two that they refused. Actually, the manager disbanded the whole performance analysis and data analysis department
Wow.
because yeah, because it was more important the financial well-being of signing players and things like that. And again, there's there should be more money invested on that side, because it's those fine margins that it can actually help. And again, you have people that really believe in data, and you have people that really don't believe it and just say, you know what, we're just going like old good old days with the tactics board on the
Mm.
pitch, and that's all you need. And again, if you want to do that, yes, it's very valid. What I say is that your chances of achieving your goals might be better and increase if you have control of what we call the controllables, right? So if you have
Mm.
control of things and improve your performance by just 1%, it might get you somewhere else that without the help you would probably wouldn't get there. Again, it really depends on what is the club vision, and so on. At Fulham, I can say that we have really good department in since I arrived. I know for sure. I know that other clubs also have great departments. And again, if you look at Premier League, I'm pretty sure almost every club has a quite big department. If you look at Championship, I would say some clubs might not have it, and League One and League Two, some departments prioritize the use of data, or just performance analysis departments that they can do both, and some clubs they don't. It's just a matter of allocating resources, and it's something that might change because uh, people undervalue the power of data in when using with the right context.
Yeah, I suppose the further you go down the leagues now, the tighter the margins are for a lot of these clubs operating, and we've seen so many clubs go out of business um, in recent seasons for a number of different reasons, i.e., the disparity of wealth in football, but even just the lack of revenue at the lower tables, the lower league tables. So um, for them, it might be a case of, well, can we actually genuinely afford to have this team of analysts? Can we allocate that resource elsewhere? However, in the long term, it might actually save them money if they can make smarter business decisions and signings. But as I said, it's so difficult the further you go down. And my next question was going to be about the relationship between, say, the playing staff, coaching staff, or the analysts at Fulham. I know you work more with the academy, but do the coaches really buy into the data side at Fulham? Because as you said, lower league clubs, or just if a particular manager or coaching staff are, I don't know, less progressive in their ways, they might turn their nose up at it.
No, I do play again. We do. The coaches buy in. I mean, the amount of data that we have to consolidate and take care and present to the coaches. Obviously, again, it goes back to the relationship, and not just at Fulham, but every other club that you have. Um, the coaches are very important because coaches have the power to decide, and again, not only to decide, maybe it's a strong word, but usually football team or clubs might be running in a way that every team plays in a certain way leading up to the first team. Let's say there's clubs that do that, and the manager decides which kind of context they want to look at some variables, which is
Mm.
it makes sense. Everything needs to be in context, and again, it's really interesting because you might see different teams that might play a different style, and you might see managers asking, "Oh, what about this specific data in this context? Can we use it this way? Can you give me this data?" So again, as a data scientist or even as a performance analyst, you do need to have the coaches to be in your side because they need to buy in. Again, as I go back to what I said uh, about one league club team that just disbanded the whole thing because the manager didn't believe in data. Again, things like that happen everywhere, and something that you guys also mentioned, it's smarter decisions, of course, like they come with more investment or not. And something that I read the other day, where I found it really interesting, is that a lot of lower league clubs, like let's say Championship below, they do spend a lot of money in agent fees. Maybe those agent fees would be better
Mm.
allocated on performance analysis departments and data science departments, because it gets to a point that are you going to buy the player with the agent? Like, how does that work in the end? So yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and again, I would say it varies from club to club. But usually, yeah, but coaches do. I know that Fulham, I can assure that, yeah, they do buy into the idea.
100%. Yeah, it's interesting because if it's driven by the management and managers, clubs change managers so often, how do you actually get some consistency going? It's so interesting. Your point earlier around, even at the academy level, that the like a philosophy or an ethos might be kind of being built even from like the top down and from the management because they want to build. Jurgen Klopp's a great example of that, wanting to enforce the same kind of formations and playing style. Pressing it at the youth levels and bring that through so that benefits the first team in the long run, which it kind of feeds into what you're saying. So, Julio, I'm really interested in your time at Mansfield Town as well as Fulham because, as I said, I support Sunderland in League One, where a bigger club than Mansfield, many would say. But I think it's really fascinating that, I mean, I assume Mansfield have a recruitment team, but I can't imagine it being too extensive. So, what could you tell us about your time there and how heavily did someone like Mansfield Town use data in the recruitment process or even performance management analysis?
So it was really interesting. I used to work at Chelsea Football Club at the foundation with another coach who, for health issues, he had to step down in coaching, and he became a scout. And he gained a lot of experience getting there, and he actually was the head of recruitment for Mansfield Town, and he saw that I was doing performance analysis and working. He asked me, "Would you like to just volunteer and see how we go through the processes and everything? How we define the variables that we want, which is again different clubs would like to have different what we call key performance indicators (KPIs)
Mm,
for those targets." And it was really interesting. You start like looking at players depending on the budget of the club, of course, depending on which leagues are these targets playing. And then you just go there, you go, and I remember everything being like on a PowerPoint kind of like Excel spreadsheet template, and you just go there, and it was really interesting. I mean, and I learned a lot from that experience. Unfortunately, it lasted 8 months because the department was disbanded. It was quite sad. I did enjoy the experience. It was an additional scouting experience in there. We watched a lot of footage because there was lockdown as well, so there was a lot of plays we could watch in a week, and it was actually a big group of volunteer scouts as well. And we were just like, okay, what do you think of this player? We watched the player for X amount of times. There's a few KPIs that we had to keep a tally on. Obviously, the department also had some data, and you have services like, for example, Y Scout and so on, where certain clubs use it to watch the matches. Let's say League One, League Two, and so on. And it's pretty much just for recruitment, really. That use that platform, and then you get to see what the player is, trying to be less biased as well, which is a problem when you're scouting just without data.
mm,
And I believe it's a good idea if you have the data, or if you have that context that you watch the player and you're like, okay, well, trying to be less subjective, and then there's a question, okay, was that a clear, or was that like a long ball? What happened really? Because you cannot really see from some of the angles, and you try to work it out, and you get a general idea
mm.
of how to report and so on. And I can actually talk about a different experience, which was really interesting. I did the same thing for an Nastved Ball Club, which is second division Norwegian club.
Okay.
Yeah, Norwegian club, and it was really interesting. A bit more refined in certain areas. That's when I really became as well more of a data analyst with that role added to my responsibility, doing some visuals with Tableau, kind of looking for some measures of different players. And again, some of the things there were quite interesting. The people did buy in, especially the owners of the club were very data driven because there was a new owner and new set of owners, and then they really were into the data analysis. It was good, but because some people wanted to, there was some disagreements on certain things, and that experience unfortunately didn't went out. But it was also still a good experience in terms of what mistakes I should not do in a big department like that, because the
Mm.
club depended on reports and people commitments and so on. So you kind of like learn the what to do and not to do. Like it's very imperative.
So just to finish off, I've got a few questions for more of discussion points. Just more generally, Julio, on just you've done what you said. You're very much part of a big wider Twitter community, and I think we've talked about your role as data scientist at Fulham, what it was like at Mansfield, but just generally, I think there's obviously been an explosion of the use of data in football. And you touched about KPIs at Mansfield Town, in terms of the recruitment side. Do you think? I mean, this is general questions now. If so, if assumptions can be made. But do you think have certain key metrics for each position they analyse, or would it depend on what the manager wants at that time? So even at Mansfield, was there a KPI for one character of player or one type of player they want to build or want to bring in for numerous positions, or was it set on a per position basis and was that specific?
No, again, like there's the general KPIs that you look, but again, and this is the beautiful thing about the evolution of football. You can have a defensive midfielder that has amazing ball playing ability. So obviously,
Mm.
you want to include those creation and kind of passing KPIs because it's relevant to that player's role, and that's how you actually find similar players when you're trying to replace players by having those KPIs. Of course, you can go for, like yes, we're looking at midfielders, especially central midfielders, with those kind of like you have a general idea which KPIs, and then you read from them what kind of player the player is, for example. It can work both ways. But yeah, at Mansfield there were certain KPIs that we wanted for a forward, and these are the KPIs we're going to look because that's the kind of forward that they wanted to look, let's say, for example. But I know at all the places people do different things. They look for general KPIs, or clubs they would create, for example, their own KPI based on different metrics, and that's how they analyze performance, or they do something outside the box. You have like a lot of new metrics. You have people who do research in terms of is there any correlation between two metrics, for example, that you can just actually combine it in one and analyze in a different way. So there's a lot sorts of things. I personally, whenever I look at players with data, and obviously I try to put in the context of team that the club is, the player is playing at, um, what's the role, what kind of player it is. So going back to the midfielder, people assume that just exists two types of a midfielder, central midfielders, the one that defends and the one that attacks. When there's so much in between those two, and again, data can be a really good thing to identify what kind of midfielder is a certain player based on certain KPIs that you choose, or some generic KPIs, and you see some like, okay, that's really interesting. So this player has quite high ball recoveries, and he's still really amazing at chances created, and you're like, okay, that's
Mm.
interesting, and you start thinking of which kind of midfielder is he or she, in this case, if you're analyzing women's football.
Yeah, I think it feels as if like the whole football world is trying to find the holy grail metric so, that will tell them everything in one particular number or ratio or percentage. My next question to you, Julio, is actually going to be on on some of these more current metrics, which I think are current. Like, so something like XG, for example, is not that current. It's actually been in the game for a while, but it's only really just been popularized. I know it got added to Sky Sports last season as part of their kind of data table they used to put on the screen. And I'm aware, or I've heard this from Etches, so this is a really bad frame of reference here, but that it's going to be on FIFA 22 this year. Um, so do you think these kind of like theories like XG, like expected assists and stuff, are starting to be used more by football teams in their kind of performance and recruitment analysis? And I suppose if you've got any experience of using those sort of expected metrics in your work.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I mean I'm not just in work in my work, but for example in general. And again, people have this misconception about like say expected goals, and
Mm.
people use it very isolated. Like you see people on like on several, even on as you said, like on the Premier League, they use it in one game. They're like, okay, if a team has, yeah, but then you didn't actually discount the fact that if a team has a penalty, your XG just goes exponentially
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
more 0.74, because that's the probability in some models, or 76, of scoring a penalty. So it's almost as certain. Of course, you're gonna have an extra xG, expected goals, than the other team if let's say they had poor shots from really difficult locations. Again, it's all about
Mm.
the context as well that you do it, and there's some companies that do great stuff with that. They do put those shots, let's say, in context, that it gives you something more approximate what you should have. But then again, you have isolated uses where people just put it, oh, that's one match. But the right thing to do, actually, in every metric, not just in expected goals, it's the context, and what is your sample size in terms of matches for you to do. Now, if I have a
Mm.
striker that my striker has an xG of 15 over 10 games, and he had 20 shots, and let's say that he also had like 2 goals, then I would say, okay, you have a problem, mate, because you're underperforming. So it's very clear. But then again, I would probably look at the video. Okay, why is my striker not doing that? And okay, maybe the reason why he has so low xG on these shots, well, they were poor shots. Maybe you can start seeing different things. Maybe his confidence is quite low, or you can go even to another conclusion that maybe this kind of player, this kind of forward, I don't mind if this kind of forward doesn't score too many goals, but is actually creating more chances for my other players around him to actually score a goal. So again,
Mm.
it really depends how you see it, the context, and how you use it. And again, you see a lot of things, and it's good that the Premier League and people are trying to using these advanced metrics, which I would say that the problem is in the way that some people are using, they're actually misusing it, and the general public and the general fans probably don't know what it is, and they just go into jump into this. Oh, I hate it. I hate this. Actually, what is that like? And you start seeing on Football Manager as well, which they have expected goals as well,
Mm.
and now on FIFA. So obviously there's an importance to it, and it's just as any other metric. Like I've seen once on Sky Sports that they were comparing two centre backs, and they were putting goals and assists. Like okay, uh, yeah, sure. I mean, now if you go in a different context of which one had more goals or assists in corners or set pieces, I'll be like, okay, that's a good way to do a very basic analysis, and
Mm.
then you can even drill down into different things. But it's just as you use it. I personally believe it's a really good indicator of what is expected from certain players, because these are mathematical models, so they do try to predict things over time. And we have an example. There's a running joke on Twitter that Brighton might cash in their expected G, because their last season they had the highest XG, expected goals of almost any Premier League team.
Yeah, I think it was like fifth or something. And another one that's been quite amusing from a Brighton perspective this season is, again, in the fantasy football community, this is where a lot of my data knowledge comes in. But Lewis Dunk, apparently his XG inside the box for Brighton is really high because, as you said, if you never actually watched football and you saw that, you think, okay, yeah, this guy's looks like he's actually someone who can score goals, but actually he's a centre half who's only ever making his shots from um, very close range. So obviously his XG for any shot is going to be fairly high. And if they're playing in a game where they are putting a lot of crosses in and getting corners in, it still tell you something. You know, if he's having shots as a centre half in the box from decent positions, that's a good indicator that he might be someone you put in your fantasy team, for example. I always say that, or I've been saying this season that I've seen so much Adama Traore love on Twitter for fantasy football, and I always say if you just took his data alone, in terms of like successful dribbles, number of dribbles, shots inside the box. Apparently, in the first few games, he had one of the highest shots inside the box for a midfield player in the Premier League. You think of that, okay, he's the first player on my team. But actually, if you watch him play, he can be quite erratic. He's not necessarily someone you put straight in. Then that's a great example of where you need to actually have the context and actually really watch the games as well and apply that context and have them in tandem um, to actually get the most out of them. So my final question, well, actually my second final question, Julio. Um, so are you aware of any kind of up and coming kind of metrics that are getting traction in the game that would be interesting? We did an article a while back when we used to run our blog on packing. So I don't know if you've heard of packing, but it's another one that's been used in the game. And then I've also heard of expected threat, which I don't have a clue what it is,
Yeah. So
but I've seen it.
yeah, with the packing is quite interesting. So in Germany, a company started looking into a concept which is how many lines does a pass breaks the opposite team, either defensive or attacking, and then you had those values into your packing measurements. And it's quite interesting because those are what you try to look for, the effectiveness of passes, that forward passes that are quite important between those lines. And I do find that quite interesting, actually. It's a very good indicator of what kind of team you're playing. And let's say if you're looking for your next opponent, and then you see a packing of, let's say, uh, 100 something in 10 games, you're like, okay, this team is very direct and play a lot between the lines and breaks a lot of them by those forward passes. So you can kind of have an indicator of the player itself and the team, how they play. In terms of the expected threat, it's really interesting because I've seen from Tom Morville from the Athletic, and
That's where I've seen it. That's where I've seen it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I've seen it before as well throughout the last season in some places, some people shedding some light into it, and it's how much threat does your build up or any action that will build up from certain players um, contribute to a goal, or the chances that that might ended up that play might ended up in a goal.
Okay, interesting. That's a great
Yeah,
that's great definitions. I just had to look at the article that we did because I want to find out the two because I remember writing this and so I knew what packing was, but I forgot the names of the ex players that were involved in its creation. So it was Stefan Reinhardt
yeah,
and Jens Hegeler. I think the latter was it. Bristol City, I believe. But yeah, it was interesting because both those players spent some time at Bayer Leverkusen, particularly Stefan Reinhardt, and for them to then come out of the game and then go into data and looking at something like packing as a metric that they're pulling together to perhaps provide to their clients, football clubs, the like analysts is really interesting. So Julio, thank you so much for coming on. My final question for you is: who has been your favourite signing of the transfer window? Or say who's your favorite, or who do you think it could be the biggest surprise? One or the other.
well, it's really difficult. I mean, I'm going to say this obviously for a lot of reasons. One, it's because I'm a sporting fan. We just lost Nuno Mendes to PSG, which is one of the best signings. 19 years old, left back, really good player. I definitely recommend to see anyone that doesn't know him. He's really, really good. I personally think he could have started last Euro as the main left back if it wasn't for injury on the first matches that it was injured, he wasn't available. But really good. But you have amazing players like I think Cucurella, for example, to Brighton. It's like one of these signings that you're like, okay, that's interesting. Really good
Mm.
numbers as well. Yeah, you have a very good. Someone was joking that there were, for clubs that actually sign interesting players, and obviously through data, they're increasing their X sensibility in terms of how they do these transfers. And yeah, like I think also Brian Hill to Spurs, it was a very good deal for both Sevilla and again,
Mm.
and Sevilla is also amazing how Monkey does all the recruitment for them. It's just amazing how they just replace players based on data. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the X sensibility because I also saw that as well. I thought it was a really good play on words. And obviously, yeah, you mentioned some really interesting players. We'll definitely take take those names away. I have to ask you this as well because I think Dryden knows I'm going to ask as well. What are your thoughts on Arsenal's transfers? Because I'm an Arsenal fan, Julio, you see, and it's not a very good time for me. So I'm hoping your answer is going to inspire a bit of belief in me.
I try not to comment a lot in terms of what some clubs do. I mean, I do comment a lot on my free time on Twitter with other people in terms. I do think in terms of players, the players that not necessarily how much money Arsenal spend. I do think yes, they did sign interesting players. Again, you get to a point that you have Man City, you have Chelsea, you have Man United. You you have clubs that spend a lot of money in the best top players. And I was saying this to someone the other day. I think the Premier League has probably right now, from Messi being in Mbappe and Neymar being there, like you have probably the best players in the Premier League. So it's really hard for a lot of clubs. So obviously you're gonna have players that are very good. Like um, I think Tommy Sayer is going to join Arsenal. Really good transfer, in my opinion. Can mostly centre back, can play centre back on the right, can play right back. Really interesting one. Odegaard, for me, is quite good in a sense of he's the only pure kind of 10 that Arsenal has. And since he already knows what Arteta wants from him, I think he will do well. And I think in football, like, and again, I do have a fan side as well, and I try not to be as reactionary, but we do react a lot as football fans. We don't
Yeah,
realize, and it might be, for example, for you as Arsenal fan, it might be really hard to hear like trust the process and everything. But if you look at managers that lasted for a long time, it's because they were backed, and they were backed for a long time, and maybe the media was not like didn't have such an impact in terms of reporting news, in terms of getting those fans more actively in social media and things like that. So that obviously that pressure to the players now that now the players don't have anymore just the press, the paper press. Now they have online communities that are talking about them. They have their personal um, Instagrams accounts and Twitters and so on. So there's a lot of factors that might go into what is it might be wrong with certain players, not just at Arsenal, but just giving kind of an example. But I do think in terms of transfers, I do think interesting. I think Ben White is actually a good centre back in terms of numbers from both when it was with Bielsa and at Brighton as well. I thought when Arsenal was negotiating the player with Brighton, I thought it would be Bizuma because he is a monster. So if
yeah.
anyone wants to see his numbers, like really interesting.
Yeah, it is indeed, and I think Julia, that's the perfect summary. Trust the process, and it's not all doom and gloom, which is what I'll take away from that one.
Well, I think it just needs some kind of cheering up after the first 3 games of the season. But yeah, hopefully we'll see a bit of our tech magic coming through. But Julio, thank you so much for coming on this evening, giving up your time to come on and talk to us about data in football and your experiences today. It was really fascinating. And really good luck with your endeavours at Fulham.
Thank you guys as well. Thank you.